Hello, my name is Nireah Johnson. Join me on A Hateful Homicide, a true crime podcast dedicated to telling the stories regarding the murders of transgender, gender non-binary, and gender diverse community members in the United States and abroad. This is A Hateful Homicide.
911, what's your emergency?
Yeah.
A transgender woman has been shot and killed in North Baltimore. Alpha?
In the U.S., trans women of color have a life expectancy of just 35 years.
This happens on a daily. Another one of my friends got killed right up the street from here.
These cases are true. The victims are real, and their voices matter. This is A Hateful Homicide. Wednesday, June 18th, 2003. Around 9 p.m., 17-year-old transgender female Nireah Johnson and her best friend, 18-year-old cisgender female Brandie Coleman, were hanging out that evening when they stopped at a traffic light and they came across 20-year-old Paul Moore and 25-year-old Curtis Ward. So Paul Moore, riding in the passenger side of Curtis Ward's car, sees Nireah Johnson in the driver's side of the car. And basically what happens is that they ultimately decide to pull over at a gas station parking lot. Nireah Johnson, Paul Moore, they get out of their vehicles. They talk a little bit, exchange phone numbers. Right, this is typical amongst young individuals. Late teens, early 20s, you see someone, you greet, chemistry, compatibility, connection, and all of that seemed to be the case for Nireah Johnson and Paul Moore. The two did decide to meet, within the next month or so after the 4th of July holidays to really just spend some time together and to get to know each other. We are under the assumption that Paul Moore did not know that Nireah Johnson was transgender when he asked her to pull over, when the two got out of the car, when they exchanged phone numbers. We are assuming under that. And Nireah Johnson has the right in that moment not to disclose her gender identity because she's just getting to know him and she has to be secure for her safety. But then we're going to go to the night of the murder. It's around the evening of July 22nd, around 10 p.m., Nireah Johnson's best friend, Brandie Coleman, calls Paul Moore's home and asks to speak to Curtis Ward. Curtis Ward, who had kind of started to form his own sort of friendship with Brandie Coleman, he picks up the phone. She asks if her and Nireah Johnson can come over and just hang out with her and Paul Moore and Curtis Ward. All of them were going to hang out again. And it seemed to be going well. Curtis Ward agreed. Brandie Coleman comes over. Nireah Johnson comes over. Eyewitnesses at the apartment complex says that they saw Nireah Johnson, Brandie Coleman, Paul Moore, and Curtis Ward all sitting outside on the balcony of the apartments in Indianapolis, Indiana. So when this murder took place, we have to really go back and peel back the timeline. We have to go back and peel out what led up to between the night of July 22nd and around 5 a.m. on July 23rd of 2003. So according to court documents, we know that Brandie Coleman reached out to Curtis Ward about coming over. We know that around 10 p.m., Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman arrives into the apartment complex. The four are seen talking to each other outside of the apartment for about a couple of hours. Eyewitnesses, for some reason, a lot of people were just kind of hanging out that night. It was a Wednesday night, but people were still up on, way into 12 a.m. on July 23rd. And so when we see, when the eyewitnesses see Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman go into the home around 12 a.m. on July 23rd, that is the last time that they are seen alive. Now, according to Curtis Ward, when he spoke to the police later, he mentions that he can recall around 12:50 that morning, Paul Moore bursting into his room with a handgun. The type of handgun, a Ruger P90 handgun. This is going to be important, you all, because this lets us know ballistics. What type of handgun was used to kill Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman? Just to go back for a moment, when I talk about these terms of transgender and cisgender, I mentioned in episode 1 regarding the murder of Amanda Milan about when someone is assigned female at birth or male at birth and they still identify as that gender, they are considered cisgender, meaning they have not undergone any form of social and or medical transitioning. In Nireah's case, she was assigned male at birth, and so she identified as female, therefore making her a transgender female. So when Paul Moore bursts into Curtis Ward's room with the Ruger P90 handgun, he demands to speak to Curtis Ward in the kitchen. The two step out of the room and they begin to have a conversation. Now, the reason why I believe that Nireah Johnson did not disclose that night as well that she was transgender was because I really don't think her and Brandie Coleman had the expectations of having sex with Paul Moore and Curtis Ward. I really believe that they were there to just hang out. They're young teenagers. They're impressionable. Brandie Coleman is a new mom. She has a 2-month-old daughter at the time that she's murdered. So she's trying to get out the house, meet people. She's newly broken up from the father of her the father of her daughter. So she's looking to get out. She reaches out to Curtis Ward. They've been having a good conversation. They all want to just hang out, talk, and continue that chemistry. We do know that phone and text message conversations had been occurring from June 18th, from the first time that Nireah Johnson and Paul Moore met, all the way up until the night of July 22nd. After that, there is no evidence that Nireah Johnson and Paul Moore ever communicated again. And the reason being is because Nireah Johnson is dead by the hands of Paul Moore. The four all end up in the living room that day, that early morning. It's about 1 a.m. And they spend about 40 minutes just talking some more, really talking about this concept of transgender, this concept of what it means to be in a different body than what you're assigned. And even though they're having these conversations, there's still no clarification as to whether Nireah Johnson is transgender. We know that Nireah Johnson, according to Curtis Ward, begins to become uncomfortable with this conversation. She excuses herself and asks to go to the restroom around about 1:30 in the morning. She goes into the restroom. We know that she's afraid for her life. She's scared. She's trying to figure out a way how to get out. She's hoping that maybe Brandie Coleman, who is cisgender, can actually diffuse the situation. Maybe if Brandie can advocate for her, then maybe this will reduce the situation and no harm and violence will come to either of them. And as much as Brandie Coleman pleaded with Curtis Ward and Paul Moore to just let them go, to just not even, continue communicating anymore, Paul Moore and Curtis Ward could not handle that. They could not handle the fact that they were not sure about Nireah Johnson's gender identity. And if she is transgender, that Brandie Coleman knew and did not say anything. So in that moment, Paul Moore, who's completely furious, who's completely angry and ready to cause violence, literally breaks in the bathroom door. Nireah Johnson is crouching over by the bathtub, rocking in a fetal position, afraid, begging, please leave me alone. Let us go. Paul Moore slams the door. Brandie Coleman can remember, according to Curtis' word, can be seen trying to stop the situation from escalating. She's pleading with Paul Moore to leave Nireah Johnson alone, to let her be, to let them be, to let them go. Brandie Coleman even mentions that she has an infant daughter to get home to. Paul Moore is not hearing any of it. In that moment, he decides that he's going to get to the bottom of this. He pulls down Nireah's pants and discovers that she's assigned male at birth, according to her anatomical sex. At this time, Nireah, age 17, is newly transitioning, maybe within a year or so. She's socially transitioning. She hasn't really medically transitioned, so she would be considered a pre-operative trans woman. And therefore, she would not have undergone any gender reassignment surgeries like vaginoplasty. None of that had happened yet. So when Paul Moore pulled down her pants and discovered that she was assigned male at birth based on her genitalia, he snapped. He yells for Curtis Ward to come in here. He shows Curtis Ward Nireah Johnson's nude body, and therefore states, see, I knew it. I knew something was off. And the reason why I personally believe that Paul Moore became suspicious is because Nireah Johnson did not want to have sex with him, because Nireah Johnson did not want him to touch her inappropriately. Just because she went in the room with him does not mean that she was inviting sex. It doesn't mean that she was inviting anything more than just a friendly conversation. And whether she wanted that or not, if she decided that she didn't want to later on, that was her right. And it wasn't his right to then go and make assumptions about her gender identity. But unfortunately, he did. And unfortunately, he discovered Nireah Johnson's gender identity, that she is transgender, that she was transgendered. And so he demands that Curtis Ward goes and grabs some wire hangers out of their closets and bind Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman up. The two are then placed in the living room, gagged. And then somewhere around 2:33 a.m., CCTV footage can see Nireah Johnson's car leaving and Curtis Ward's car following. So we speculate that most likely Paul Moore asked Curtis Ward to follow him in Nireah Johnson's car. The car that Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman came in was a Jeep Cherokee. Nireah and Brandie are placed in the back of the Jeep, tied and gagged. And as Paul Moore and Curtis Ward begin to travel in Indianapolis, they stumble across a wooded area in Fall Creek Corridor Park. As they get into this corridor area, the opening of the park, remember, it's about 4:45 a.m. at this time. They've gotten Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman into the vehicles without being noticed, because at this point it's about 4 o'clock in the morning. Most individuals are asleep, getting ready for the Thursday working day. So the witnesses who saw them go in around 12 a.m. have since then retreated into their own homes to retire for the evening. So when they take the victims out, bind and gag, they're still alive, but they're unable to make noise and they're unable to cause any attention that would alert witnesses or neighbors to look out their window. So we know that Curtis Ward and Paul Moore placed Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman into the back of the car around 3:30 that morning. They get to Fall Creek around 4:30. And then they ungag Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman, where the two begin to beg and plead for their lives. Nireah Johnson is stating that she's sorry, according to Curtis Ward. She's sorry. She won't do this again. She has a family. She's only 17. She's pleading. Bang goes the gun. The bullet enters Nireah Johnson's forehead as she utters those last final words. Brandie Coleman is left next. She's pleading with Paul Moore as well. Please, I have a 2-month-old daughter. I have a family. Please do not do this. Bang goes Brandie Coleman. The two had been shot in the forehead with the Ruger P90 handgun in the back of the Jeep. And what happens next is of such horror that you cannot even believe how depraved humanity can be at times. How hateful this homicide truly was, all because of Nireah Johnson's gender identity. If that wasn't enough, Paul Moore and Curtis Ward goes to a gas station. They have an empty gas jug. They fill it up with gas. They go back to Fall Creek, where Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman, at this time around 5 a.m., are dead. On July 23rd, 2003, and they go back. They douse the Jeep with gas. And then they set it on fire. And so somewhere between 5 a.m. and around 12 p.m., the car had been burning. Residents, people, citizens of Indianapolis, whether it's for a morning jog, whether it's for an afternoon stroll, whatever the case may be, someone ultimately discovered the burning vehicle. They called the ambulance, they called the firefighters, they called 911. And when they called 911, the emergency personnel immediately rushed out to Fall Creek. And there they discovered the bodies. The bodies are burned beyond recognition. They're charred. Dental records are not even able to help. But Brandie Coleman's mother filed a missing person report. And when she filed that missing persons report, she ultimately discovered that her daughter had been last seen going into the apartment of Paul Moore and Curtis Ward's. We know that through time that the bodies are identified. So around July 31st of 2003, both Paul Moore and Curtis Ward have been arrested for the murders of Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman. We know when the firefighters were alerted to the burning vehicle, they were found lying on the back seat of the Jeep. Again, their bodies were burned beyond recognition. They were burned so bad you couldn't even determine race or sex of either victim. We know that the Indianapolis, Marion County police decided that the murders were that. They were homicides. We know that the personnel ultimately discovered the identity of the victims because on July 24th of 2003, that's that Thursday, the next day, the coroner's office officially released Nireah Johnson's and Brandie Coleman's names as the homicide's victims. He also determined, Coroner John Mitchell also reported that each victim had been shot by the Ruger. Remember that each victim had been shot in the forehead before the fire started. Also, the police investigators of Marion County determined that gasoline had been poured into the back seat and ignited. So we know that the vehicle was later identified by Brandie Coleman's mom, Mary Coleman, when she recognized the vehicle from news reports. She had already reported her daughter missing because she knew that her daughter would never abandon her 2-month-old daughter and not be home the next morning to feed her and care for her. So when she goes and calls and files a missing persons report, and later in the news, because the news is also now covering this crime, and again, we don't know who the victims are, so this is becoming a prolific case, and they discover in the news media, the footage, Mary Coleman discovers the FedEx plate on the front of the car. She knew this FedEx plate of the car belonged to Brandie Coleman. The reason why, because Mary Coleman herself worked at that FedEx where the plate was given. When she saw the FedEx plate on the vehicle, she then realized that she needed to call the police and file a report. And as she files that report, around Thursday, July 31st, 2003, Paul Moore is also arrested, again, along with Curtis Ward. But Paul Moore also had a friend by the name of Adrian Beverly. And so what we know is that Adrian Beverly was also a friend of Paul Moore and Curtis Ward's, and was also one of the individuals that Paul Moore reached out to for help. And so we know that when Adrian Beverly, identifies Paul Moore as well as being the person that killed Nireah Johnson, based on the confession of Paul Moore to Adrian Beverly, as well as including Adrian Beverly into the mix by saying, hey, can you make sure that we clean our vehicles? Can you make sure that we clean the apartment, right? So Adrian Beverly is serving as this kind of accessory after the fact. And when she learns of the crime, she definitely went ahead and turned Moore in. And so they are ultimately charged. Paul Moore and Curtis Ward were arrested, charged with murder, confinement, and arson. But here's the thing, everyone. This is 2003. So in this moment, we're having a lot of Nireah's information being the fact that she's being misgendered. They're using her old name. They're not using her preferred name. Even media footage is calling her by her dead name. The name that she chooses to no longer associate as. She's even unfortunately buried in that same name today. So, as this case began to really center on what it was about a man who could not handle the fact that a transgender woman did not want to have sex with him, one, did not disclose her gender identity, and whether that is true or not, we're not sure, but according to testimony from Paul Moore's attorney, he was under the assumption that Nireah Johnson was cisgendered. And upon getting intimate into the early mornings of July 23rd, 2003, he began to become suspicious. Unfortunately, this led to Nireah's murder. But the case wasn't over. We know that a third man was also arrested in this case. Adrian Beverly was the one who identified Paul Moore and Curtis Ward based off of the confession. She served in that capacity. But Clarence McGee, a friend of, I'm sorry, not actually a friend, but he's actually the older maternal half-brother of Paul Moore and a friend of Curtis Ward. He's arrested as well for helping his brother Paul Moore. get rid of some additional evidence, right? Clarence McGee helps get rid of the gun. Clarence McGee helps, come up with an alibi. They even told the police when they were initially investigated that, Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman came over, but they left on their own. And they don't know how they landed in Fall, Creek, burned to death. So as we go into April 14th, 2004, this is going to be the first trial of Paul Moore and Clarence McGee. You may be asking yourself, well, what about Curtis Ward? What happened to him? Well, he decides to testify against Paul Moore and Clarence McGee in exchange for lesser charges and a lesser sentence. As a result of Curtis Ward's testimony against Paul Moore and Clarence McGee, the jury found both men guilty. Both Paul Moore and Clarence McGee was convicted on 2 counts of murder, criminal confinement, and arson. McGee was also convicted of arson, assisting a criminal, and obstruction of justice. Around Wednesday, May 5th, 2004, Judge Robert Altus gave Moore combined sentences of 120 years for the murders of Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman. Moore also received consecutive 55-year sentences for the murder of Johnson and Coleman, and concurrent 10-year sentences for each count of confinement and arson. Clarence McGee was only sentenced to 10 years in prison for being an accomplice and has since been released from the Indianapolis Department of Corrections. Paul Moore did try to appeal his conviction, and unfortunately, or fortunately for the victims, his sentence were upheld and all appeals were denied as of May 2005. So let's take a moment, some time, to get to know a little bit more about our victims. Nireah Johnson, age 17, and Brandie Coleman, age 18. Both lost their lives tragically on Wednesday morning, July 23rd, 2003, around 5 a.m. Nireah Johnson, born 1986, as described as a lovely, outgoing, energetic person who was just coming into her own. She was getting ready to enter her senior year of high school that fall of 2003, literally within a month and a half. And she was expected to graduate high school in Indianapolis in 2004. While in high school, she meets her really good friend, Brandie Michelle Coleman, born 1985. When they first met, Nireah, a freshman, and Coleman, Brandie Coleman, a sophomore. The two began as friends. They hung out, and then they even became sisters. Nireah confided in Brandie about her gender identity around 2001, around the age of 15, and Brandie Coleman completely supported Nireah. So much to the fact that Nireah really could count on Brandie to be there for her, to go places with her when she was uncomfortable. Nireah, who was still new into her gender journey, was still uncomfortable going into certain public spaces, unsure of how the public would receive her. Nireah Johnson, described as a beautiful 5'7", voluptuous African-American trans woman, trans teenager, trans girl, we should say, in the prime of her life. She loved the music. She was a big fan of Mary J. Blige, according to her other friends, Paul Sebastian and Tony Stark. She loved people. She would give you the shirt off her back. She was described as very funny. She could make you laugh as well. There was always a good time when Nireah was around. Mary Coleman, the mother of Brandie Coleman, described her as dedicated. She graduated high school just a couple of months before. And at the same time, as she's graduating high school, she gives birth to her daughter. And Brandie is also described as being forgiving, being open-minded, and being a really, really good friend and support system to Nireah Johnson, especially as Nireah went under her gender journey, as she began to undergo her gender journey. And so when Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman met Paul Moore and Curtis Ward that night of June 18, 2003, they were really looking for people to hang out with and get to know and spend time with. And Brandie Coleman, who had been with her high school boyfriend on and off for a couple of years, the father of her daughter, had recently split. So Brandie was also looking to get back out there, put herself back out there. And, even though her and Nireah were not expecting to meet Paul Moore and Curtis Ward, Mary Coleman can remember Brandie coming to her saying, "Oh, Mom, I've met this guy named Curtis. He's attractive. He's a few years older. He has a job. He even has his own place." So this was for her at that time a step up from, her high school sweetheart who was at that time still trying to figure out what he wanted, if he was even committed to being a dad. And so to meet someone like Curtis Ward was a huge breath of fresh air. And even for Nireah Johnson, even though her high school classmates knew that she was transgendered, she still wasn't dating anyone. She still wasn't out and getting to know people. So when she met Paul Moore, this was really one of the first guys to take interest in her since her gender journey began. And honestly, according to both Mary Coleman and Paul Sebastian, family and friends of the victims, they both said that both Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman spoke highly of Paul Moore and Curtis Ward, citing that the two men seemed fairly kind and caring and considerate. And they would even spend time, like up to hours, texting and talking on the phone. Both Brandie Coleman and Nireah Johnson would both spend copious amounts of time on the phone texting and talking to Paul Moore and Curtis Ward. So the irony and the tragedy as well, not only with their murders, is that Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman actually saw Paul Moore and Curtis Ward as good guys. And they had no idea that just within a month of meeting, that they would be dead. Since this crime has happened, this case really began to catapult in the Indiana and Indianapolis community the visibility for trans individuals. This case garnered so much attention that it was even covered by the Orlando Centennial in Orlando, Florida. It's really unfortunate when we look at these cases. So many times we have to ask ourselves, how did this happen and why? And with this case, like so many others that we're going to continue to cover, it was simply these young trans individuals, and they don't even have to be young, they can be older as well. It's simply trans and gender non-binary and gender diverse community members living their lives, standing in their truth, and then it's snuffed out by someone who is not aware of gender identities, that are not aware of transgender individuals, and certainly not at a mindset to be able to navigate through gender identity. But that's no excuse to kill someone. It's no excuse to go and shoot both victims in the head, douse the car on fire, ignite it with a flame, and let it basically burn for 7 hours until passerbyers discovered the burning vehicle. There was an interview done with Paul Moore following his appeals being completely, closed and done for good. And this interview occurred about 5 years after the murder and about 4 years into his sentencing, into his conviction. Someone wanted to take a moment and interview Paul Moore. This someone is named Gillian Phillips. And she's part of the British UK media, and this case captivated her at that time, partly because she had a friend around the same age as Nireah who was trans and white, but had also went through a similar homicide in the UK. And for Gillian Phillips, she really wanted to understand why these cisgendered men, specifically in cases cisgendered men of color, are killing mainly trans women of color. So, on August 17th, 2008, Gillian Phillips prepares to fly from the UK, United Kingdom, to Indianapolis, Indiana, and go to the Department of Corrections to interview Paul Moore. Remember, at this point, he's already serving at least 300 years in prison, along with Ward, who has his sentence, along with McGee, who has his sentence. But she really wanted to talk to Paul Moore, more so than Clarence McGee and Curtis Ward, because Paul Moore was the actual perpetrator. He was the one, at the age of 20, decided to kill 2 young women, one of the trans experience and one of the cis experience. She flies out from the United Kingdom, landing on August 18th, 2003. She goes to the prison and sets up a time along with her staff to talk to Paul Moore. She asks him, "Why, Paul? As you've had time to look back at the actions of July 23rd, 2003, fast forward 5 years later to August 18th, 2008, she asked him, quote unquote, have you had time to reflect on your actions and behavior? Moore states, yes. He admits that at that time, he was under the influence of alcohol. He was under the influence of drugs. He states, because there was never a toxicology done on the bodies to determine if Nireah Johnson and or Brandie Coleman both were drinking and or doing any drugs. But according to the interview with Paul Moore, he states that himself, Curtis Ward, as well as Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman all participated in drinking on the porch, the balcony that night. They also participated in drugs inside of the home. And that unfortunately, this continued to lead to a situation of violence. He was intoxicated. He was, deranged, delusional. He wasn't sure. And he ultimately decided to act. He knew in that moment that he was going to kill both Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman. Quote unquote by Paul Moore to Gillian Phillips, he says, I knew when I saw that she had what she had that I couldn't let her live anymore. in his mind, still 5 years later, he still felt that he was wronged by Nireah Johnson. He did seem to be somewhat remorseful, according to some other sources that were part of that interview process, but only remorseful that he got caught, not that he killed her. Jillian Phillips also later interviewed Clarence McGee, the older brother of Paul Moore. And he even said that Paul was very proud of what he did. He bragged about the fact that he had killed these two, quote unquote, sissies. He even used some other expletives to describe both Nireah Johnson and Brandie Coleman. He even then later said that Paul Moore, quote unquote, told Clarence McGee that he was even pissed at Brandie for the fact that she knew that Nireah Johnson was trans and did not warn them. And so in that moment, he felt that justice was served. Jillian Phillips left that interview being shook, feeling that despite what Paul Moore had said, that she knew that he never felt guilty. And it was sad because you're looking at this 20-year-old young man with his whole life ahead of him, and he has given that away. Now, I can't say if we went and interviewed Paul today, or Curtis or Clarence, if they would still feel the same way. Obviously they're a lot older. This murder happened, almost 18 years ago. So he certainly had more time to reflect. But I'm going to pretty much guess that if he didn't change in 5 years since murdering her at that time, I doubt he's changed within 18 years. So as we get ready to wrap up this case, I just want to remind each and every one of you, if you don't know someone who's trans, get to know someone who's trans. Take the time to really know them, even if you're attracted to them, especially cis men who are attracted to trans women. Please take the time to get to know the person that you're dating. And if they choose not to tell you that they're trans in the beginning, it's because they're thinking of their safety. And they're even wondering if this is going to go anywhere. Why disclose my gender identity to someone if I know the relationship isn't going to go anywhere, especially if it's only friendship? And to this day, we're not quite sure if Nireah Johnson wanted more from Paul. We know that she thought he was handsome. We know that he was one of the first guys to give her attention since her gender journey. But we're not sure if it was going to if she even wanted it to lead somewhere romantic. She was getting ready to start her senior year of high school. So who knows what her future would have held and who else she would have met. So as a cautionary tale to the cisgendered men, before you react, take a moment and really take a deep breath and think to yourself, the actions that I'm about to take because I did not know this person was trans, is it worth me spending the rest of my life in prison for? Nireah Johnson was only a young 17-year-old trans woman trying to live her life and to be happy. And unfortunately, on the morning of July 23rd, 2003, her life ended by the hands of Paul Moore. And also, as a casualty to this tragedy, her best friend, Brandie Coleman, age 18, a single mom of a 2-month-old daughter at the time, is gone. These families are wrecked. They're shattered. There's no bringing them back. Mary Coleman, the mother of Brandie Coleman, continues to raise awareness regarding these types of homicides. And I think her and the others tireless community members are doing so. Remember, A Hateful Homicide is a true crime podcast focusing on the murders of transgender, gender diverse, and gender non-binary community members. There are more stories to be told. So, Nireah Johnson, 1986 to July 23rd, 2003. And Brandie Coleman, 1985 to July 23rd, 2003. We remember you both today, tomorrow, forever, and always. Thank you so much for joining the second episode of A Hateful Homicide. Join me next week as we go into our third case. Stay tuned to find out what it is. Again, if you have any feedback, suggestions, any cases that you may think that I should cover, please feel free to reach out to me. You can follow me at Mallory, Mallery, Jenna, Jenna 90. As a Black trans woman, I'm so honored to be able to tell the stories of my fallen family members who are no longer here to have their voice. These people existed. They were on this earth for however long they were, and they deserve to have their stories told. And I'm just going to continue to do that on A Hateful Homicide. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.